Welcome, anointed soul. You didn't stumble onto these words, you were summoned, because faith, real faith, often begins in whispers, in silence, in moments when no one is applauding, no one is validating, and certainly no one is understanding. You weren't chasing noise. You weren't performing for attention. You were answering a call no one else could hear. While others waited for lightning shows and bright signs from the heavens, you responded to a still, quiet nudge in your spirit. You followed conviction, not comfort, and heaven took notice. Let's be honest, faith isn't loud when it starts. Faith is subtle. It's inconvenient. It's unglamorous. Faith begins when the spotlight is off and the crowd has left. It's the obedience you give when nothing makes sense. And you, yes, you have walked that kind of path. You didn't follow God when the blessings were obvious, pre-packaged, or wrapped with applause. You followed him when fear made more sense than faith. You chose to obey when logic told you to quit. You walked away from what glittered because you could smell the compromise behind the shine. You turned down applause because your spirit recognized counterfeit elevation. What you didn't know was that your choices, though made in obscurity, were being recorded in eternity. You thought you were just making hard decisions in silence. But the reality is, your obedience has been archived in the archives of heaven and bookmarked by someone on earth, someone with influence, someone watching, someone who saw you walk away from gold-plated traps with your soul intact. They didn't say a word then, but they felt the weight of your choices. Almost every great move of God was ignited by someone who wasn't flashy, wasn't famous, wasn't flawless, but they were faithful. And you fit that lineage. While others went viral, you went vertical. While the world chased after clicks, you chased after clarity. While they curated highlight reels, you cultivated holiness. And now, something is shifting. There's a divine reversal in the works. The very people who overlooked you are now turning their heads. The very ones who thought you were too deep, too slow, too serious are beginning to feel the drought in what they once drank from, because you weren't trying to win the crowd. You were trying to stay aligned. Let's talk about what you've done. You were willing to look absolutely foolish in public because of a private word from God. You left good-paying jobs. You walked out of picture-perfect relationships. You declined invitations that looked like dream opportunities, all because your spirit whispered, "This isn't it." You moved without guarantees. You obeyed without explanations. You leapt with nothing but prayer and purpose. And while others laughed, while they rolled their eyes and labeled you dramatic or delusional, you just kept walking. Not because it felt good, often it didn't, but because quitting would have meant betraying the deepest truth inside of you. What you didn't know then was that someone with real power was paying attention, not just watching you stumble or rise, but studying your posture under pressure. They've seen people bend for acceptance. They've watched influencers trade truth for trends. But you moved with such quiet conviction that it startled them. While others shouted to be noticed, your silence had substance. While they networked for approval, you fasted for alignment. And now, the very person who once overlooked you can't forget the weight you carried without needing applause. They're not just impressed. They're being pulled by the gravity of your authenticity. Because, in a world full of noise, your clarity rang loudest. Let's go deeper. You didn't just survive darkness, you declared war on it. With no backup plan, with no rescue in sight, you stepped into the shadows. Not with fanfare, but with fierce resolve. You walked through betrayal, heartbreak, spiritual drought, financial strain, and emotional breakdowns. And through it all, you kept showing up. You fought not because you had answers, but because your spirit couldn't sit still in defeat. That level of fight is rare. That kind of spiritual boldness isn't taught, it's born. It's built. It's baptized in fire. You weren't fighting for a brand or a platform. You weren't performing for approval. You were fighting to stay connected to something greater than yourself. And while others were busy explaining themselves, you were enduring in silence. That scared people, not because you were aggressive, but because you were unshakable. They expected you to fold. They waited for you to implode. But when you didn't break like they thought, it disrupted something, because they realized your strength didn't come from circumstances. It came from covenant. And someone with reach noticed, not a follower, not a fan, someone with authority, someone who knows what it looks like to see people fall under lesser pressure. They saw the conditions you walked through, the absence of applause, the lack of support, and still, you stood. Still, you served. Still, you worshipped. That doesn't go unnoticed. It can't, because true endurance makes a sound that only the wise can hear. It's not loud, but it's seismic. You didn't look strong while you were walking through it. You didn't look impressive, but your silence, your persistence, your refusal to quit, it screamed louder than any viral victory speech. You were being sharpened while others were being showcased. And now, your scars are your credentials. Your private battles are your platform. And someone is stepping forward not because of your appearance, but because of your essence. You walked away from the familiar, from safety, from places and people that once defined you, not because you had a better option, but because staying started to feel like spiritual death. You didn't have a 5-year plan. You didn't have a parachute, but you had a whisper. And that whisper said, "Go." So you did. And while most people mocked you, you kept moving. You trusted that the God who called you would keep you, even when you had no idea what came next. That obedience cannot be fabricated. It cannot be mimicked. It can only come from someone who has truly died to fear, while others needed 10 confirmations and a committee vote. You moved because you knew delay would cost your soul. And someone saw that, someone in power who has been let down by people with no backbone. They saw you walk away from applause, ease, and ego, and they were moved, not by how loud you were, but by how convicted you stayed when silence surrounded you. You weren't trying to stand out. You were just trying to stay alive spiritually. But in doing so, you became unforgettable. And now, heaven isn't the only place recording your obedience. Someone on earth is ready to reward it. You didn't just wander into spiritual strength, you were forged into it. And now, even your silence carries weight. People used to wonder why you were so quiet, why you walked alone, why you didn't fight to be understood. But what they couldn't grasp was that you were being trained for something beyond their comprehension. You weren't isolating, you were being insulated. Heaven was pulling you into a sacred place, away from the distractions, away from shallow applause, into the quiet where real warriors are formed. And here's what made your process different. You never needed a map. You didn't require confirmation from a crowd. You were willing to let go of stability without a backup plan. The people around you said you were crazy, irresponsible, unrealistic, but you weren't running away from life. You were chasing alignment. That voice inside God's voice whispered, "This isn't where you belong anymore." So you left, not knowing what was ahead, not even knowing if provision would catch you mid-air. You just trusted that it would, That kind of obedience terrifies people who've built their entire existence around comfort. You didn't leave for a better opportunity, you left, because staying would have meant betraying your spirit. And what no one told you is this: that kind of loyalty to God screams louder in silence than 1,000 declarations ever could. Someone powerful saw it. Someone who's been surrounded by performers, by people who sell integrity for platforms, by those who follow the trends of power rather than the pulse of purpose. And when they looked at you, quiet, consistent, steady, they felt something different, something real, something rare. You didn't beg for their recognition. You didn't even know they were watching, but they were, and your obedience spoke volumes. You became the proof they didn't know they needed, that real integrity still exists. That conviction hasn't gone extinct. You were walking in the dark with a light they couldn't see, and yet somehow it exposed everything fake around them. Now, without warning, they're stepping forward, not to congratulate your popularity, but to honor the weight you carried when nobody clapped. Let's talk about your silence, because the truth is, you took hits no one saw. You didn't retaliate when people tried to drag your name. You didn't respond to the slander, the whispers, the accusations. You didn't jump online to defend yourself. Not because you were weak, but because you understood a higher principle. You knew God was watching the replay in HD. You trusted that when the time was right, the truth would rise. And while the world clapped for comebacks, you stayed calm. You let God do the talking. That kind of restraint only comes from spiritual discipline. It's not pride, it's peace. They mistook your silence for submission. But what they didn't realize is that you weren't ignoring them. You were investing in your growth. You were building strength in secret. And while they were busy performing for approval, you were preserving your soul. That's rare. That's holy. And someone with real discernment recognized it. They saw how you carried pain with grace, how you moved with dignity while people tried to bait you into drama. They noticed how you stayed clean in character when chaos would have justified retaliation. And that struck something in them, because they've seen too many people fold under pressure, too many leaders crumble when the spotlight fades. But you stayed rooted. You didn't need attention to keep your integrity alive. And now they're remembering you. Not because you forced them to, but because your silence left an imprint. You weren't flashy, but you were faithful. You weren't loud, but you were grounded. And that speaks to a depth that can't be fabricated. In a world where everyone's reacting, you responded with restraint. And that power, that spiritual restraint, that's exactly what they've been missing. You didn't just avoid the petty battles, you elevated above them. And now, you're being pulled into rooms where peace is more powerful than performance. You didn't choose fear disguised as logic. You didn't fall for the trap of safe options wrapped in common sense. You chose faith raw, inconvenient, terrifying faith, because something deep in your gut told you God's voice was better than man's map. And so you walked away, from deals that seemed perfect, from opportunities people would have killed for. You let them go because something inside whispered, "This isn't right." That kind of inner clarity can't be taught. It's birthed through intimacy with God. While others celebrated strategy, you were anchored in surrender. And now the very people who said you were being too deep, too intense, too spiritual are circling back with empty souls and tired eyes. Their logic didn't keep them safe. Their safe choices didn't preserve their purpose. But you're still standing. You're still whole. You're still anointed. Because you didn't trade your soul for a shortcut. And the tables are turning. The ones who mocked you now respect you. The ones who thought you missed your moment are realizing you were never chasing a moment, you were stewarding a mantle. Someone in authority sees that now. They're not drawn to your popularity. They're drawn to your peace. They're not impressed by your numbers. They're impressed by your discernment. Because in a world full of people who chose safety, you chose spirit. Let's be clear, you didn't preach loyalty. You lived it. You didn't wave flags and quote cliches about faithfulness. You just showed up, over and over again, even when no one was watching, even when there was no applause, even when it cost you emotionally, mentally, financially. You stayed the course. You kept your word. You didn't disappear when the benefits dried up. You didn't ghost the mission when the gratitude vanished. That kind of loyalty isn't normal. It's supernatural. And someone who's been burned by fake commitment over and over again saw your consistency and couldn't look away. They've had people in their corner who only stayed while it was easy, who only showed up when the spotlight was on. But you were faithful in silence, loyal without leverage, steady without needing to be seen. And now, you're the person they trust the most, not because of what you said, but because of how you endured. You didn't announce your loyalty. You proved it. And that has more value than talent, charisma, or charm. That's what separates the chosen from the convenient. That's what heaven honors. And now earth is catching up. Someone who could open doors is now turning keys. Because they want what you've been carrying. Not for show, but for real alignment. You didn't just survive the storm. You were refined by it, while others scrambled to stay relevant, to preserve their image. You preserved your soul. You didn't trade authenticity for applause. You didn't let popularity define your pace. Instead, you embraced stillness. You embraced the slow, the deep, the sacred work of becoming whole. And in that quiet obedience, you built something most people can't comprehend: soul wealth. Not the kind that glitters under stage lights, but the kind that anchors you when life caves in. That kind of depth can't be faked. It can't be bought. And now, someone with real authority sees it clearly. They've seen people who looked successful but were empty inside. They've watched entire platforms collapse under the weight of pretense. But you stayed steady. You cultivated peace while others chased platform. You didn't perform. You aligned. You didn't chase the spotlight. You carried one within. And now that quiet consistency is pulling you into favor you didn't apply for. You didn't beg to be picked. You became undeniable. Your presence became your promotion. Your wholeness became your witness. And that's why they're choosing you now. Not for show, not for strategy, but because the real ones are starving for something real. And you, by simply staying true, became the answer they didn't even know they needed. You didn't sell out. You built value while being overlooked. When nobody was reposting you, when nobody was clapping, when nobody even knew your name, you kept building. You put in the work when it felt like no one would ever notice. That kind of quiet grind separates you. It marks you. You weren't waiting for validation to begin. You weren't looking around for permission. You moved in silence, led by conviction. You wrote when no one was reading. You served when no one said thank you. You prayed when it felt like no one heard. You gave your best, not because of the crowd, but because of the call. That's what makes you different. That's why the soil beneath you is bearing fruit others can't explain. Because you didn't grow from clout. You grew from character. You didn't push your way into a room. You became the kind of person the room needed. And now, someone with reach, someone tired of plastic charisma and hollow hype, has been watching. They see what you've built in the shadows. They sense the depth behind your stillness. They're done with smoke and mirrors. They're looking for roots. And in you, they see substance. They're not investing in your persona. They're investing in your process. Because, while others went viral, you went vital. And vital things last. You allowed yourself to be misunderstood. And that, too, was holy. You let people label you, question you, even laugh at you, and you didn't clap back. Not because you lacked a voice, but because you had peace. You didn't waste breath explaining what God was unfolding. You trusted that truth would speak in time. And it is the same people who called you lost are now calling you wise. The same ones who said you were being too spiritual are now drowning in noise and looking for your clarity. You weren't arrogant. You were aligned. You weren't difficult. You were different. And someone with real insight sees that now. They're done with people who perform under pressure but collapse under truth. They're looking for someone who doesn't need a stage to stand strong. And that's you. Your clarity has become your calling card. Your silence has become your sermon. And your integrity. It's opened a door that no title ever could. You said no to doors everyone else was begging to walk through. You saw the shine. You saw the opportunity. But you also saw the compromise. You recognized the hidden strings, the subtle price tags attached to your peace, your identity, your soul, and you walked away, not because you had a better offer, but because you valued your calling too much to dilute it. That decision didn't just preserve you. It distinguished you. It told the world, I know who I am. And no platform, paycheck, or position will make me forget it. People said, you missed your moment. But the truth is, you dodged a trap. What they thought was your delay was actually your deliverance. And now, someone who's seen people lose themselves behind polished doors is ready to build with someone who refused to play the game. You didn't perform. You persevered. You didn't hustle to be chosen. You held your peace until heaven made it clear. You are the opportunity, not the one chasing it. You didn't just stay in the fire, you let it shape you. Others ran the moment it got uncomfortable, but you stayed through betrayal, through silence, through spiritual warfare that had no words. You let the fire temper you, not burn you. And that's why you carry a stillness now that unsettles shallow spaces. You walk into rooms and shift the atmosphere, not because of what you say, but because of who you became in the flames. And now someone influential feels it. They don't know why they're drawn to you yet, but your essence is magnetic. It's marked, it's undeniable. You didn't skip the crushing. And that's why you can carry the crown. You didn't fake your healing. And that's why your peace feels real. You were shaped in silence. And now your voice, without even speaking, is louder than any microphone. You let your faith age like wine. You didn't chase soda pop miracles, those fizzy, flashy, instant breakthroughs that fizz out just as fast. You let God do the slow work. You let your roots deepen. While everyone else begged for quick turnarounds, you let time teach you. You didn't rush the promise. You respected the process. And that kind of faith, it matures. It multiplies. It lasts. Now someone with real wisdom sees you. They've seen what happens when people rise too fast. They've watched the burnout, the implosions, the scandals. But you didn't blow up. You grew up. And that kind of development can't be manufactured. It's spiritual. It's eternal. They see your patience, your stability, your humility, and they trust it. Not just to influence people, but to carry legacy. Because they know that those who are faithful in obscurity are often the ones most ready for elevation. You never needed a pulpit. Your life was the sermon. You didn't chase the mic. You didn't demand attention. You didn't perform for applause. You simply lived the message. You embodied the faith, the grace, the obedience, the endurance. You weren't trying to be seen. You were trying to be real. And now, that quiet life you lived in the shadows is speaking louder than 10,000 sermons. And someone who has seen too many people preach what they don't live is looking at you differently now. They don't want more hype. They want truth. They want people whose scars speak louder than their titles. They're not after the loud ones. They're after the loyal ones. And you, because you let your life preach instead of your mouth, you've become the kind of person that power respects. You disrupted the system without trying. You scared the status quo because you answered to a kingdom they couldn't control. You didn't play their game. You didn't bow to their idols. You weren't rebellious, you were obedient. And that obedience shook the room. It wasn't loud. It wasn't boastful. But it was holy. You stood your ground when it would have been easier to blend in. And now the system that once rejected you is seeking you out. Because what made you a threat then is what makes you a solution now. You weren't chasing the world. You were building for the kingdom. You weren't asking to be seen. You were asking to stay aligned. And now that the world is waking up to its own emptiness, your obedience, your endurance, your integrity is calling them higher. The story isn't over. It's just getting started. You didn't miss your moment. You've been becoming it. And now, heaven isn't the only one applauding. Earth is finally responding. God bless you.